Good morning. Thank you, Alicia. I'm delighted to be here. I've been involved with Hawkwood for a long time, and it's always a pleasure to see the good works that are done here and the way they bring people together, create new energy, build on the foundations of what's gone before, and then get these little seeds kind of sprouting over time. And I do think probably that there are going to be a lot of people here today who will need this a bit, this moment in the Hawkwood sun, as it were, because I don't think it's a particularly easy moment right now. And I know that a lot of this weekend will be about, quite rightly, about celebrating the amazing stuff that is going on at the community level, in our own workplaces, our homes, the places that are special to us in the natural world. And we can't do what we have to do without that kind of celebration. But equally, we have to be very mindful about the context in which we're doing our work and the ways in which that external context impacts on us and everything that we seek to do. And I am going to spend a little bit of time talking about that, because if we're not plugged into that external context and understanding how it influences what it is that we're doing ourselves, we're going to be missing a trick. And we're perhaps going to be firing off in the wrong way to enable us to bring many of these green seeds, many of these new ideas to fruition over the course of the next 5 years. Not necessarily 5 years. I'm just a bit focused on 5 years right now, as it happens. And part of that is to do with this inevitable, very complex dynamic of how we deal with 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back, this whole routine. And I was very, very struck by that the other day when I went to the 50th celebration of an amazing organization called Practicality. And for those who are ancient, including myself, you will recall that Practicality used to be called the Intermediate Technology Development Group, ITDG. It took them about 30 years to realize this wasn't the catchiest of names or sets of initials, and at that point they became Practicality. And ITDG, as it was then, was set up by Fritz Schumacher and his very close colleague George McRobie. And it was all about many of the things that we take for granted now, which is the power of people in their own communities to use appropriate materials and ideas to fashion solutions to the problems they face. And from day one, that is what they did, with a level of creativity and persistence and a readiness to learn and move on when things didn't work and so on. And just going to their 50th anniversary and thinking about that extraordinary, cumulative impact on the lives of millions of people was really sobering to see the degree to which the net contribution of our movement, and I'm going to be fairly loose about that today because we're not going to do a great academic dismantling of what the movement is or isn't, but if you look at it from the perspective of that net contribution, it is utterly extraordinary. Utterly extraordinary. And it was a really special moment to think about how each of these different stages builds on what has gone before and gives us the hope that we will go on building on that, because that's really the critical bit. But at the same time, there were lots of people there who said, realistically speaking, in 50 years, are we entitled to think that the rate, the scale, and the depth of change that we set out to engineer, to create, is commensurate with the challenge that we face today? And realistically speaking, everybody kind of acknowledges that that isn't at the right place at the moment. The scale of change isn't at the scale we need it to be. The speed of change isn't moving as fast as we need it to be. The inclusivity of the change processes, i.e. the number of people involved in this fantastic collective determination to change the basic nature of society. We don't have enough diversity and inclusivity in the movement and in the organizations that we're very closely involved in. I'm not trying to take you to a dark place at the start of the festival, because after all, this is a very happy moment to celebrate some of these things, but I am intent on reminding everybody about that reality, especially today. And for those who are not UK citizens, you don't have to listen to the next 5 minutes because it's UK specific. For those who are UK citizens, but are intent on protecting your psychological resilience, you don't have to listen for the next 5 minutes, because I've got nothing happy to offer you during that time. But for those who have a kind of stirring in their bowels or their heart or their brain or wherever it might be, that this is going to be a bit of a story now with this particular government, then do please listen for the next 5 minutes. Because for me, it's perfectly clear where we are now in terms of the nature of this government and the intentions of this government vis-à-vis everything. Everything we stand for. And I mean everything. And that, I think, is really staggering to understand. And I can't help but contrast the equivalent moment back in 2010, when many of us were looking at the new coalition government and thinking, okay, wonder where that's going to go. Sort of doesn't look too good on the surface, but then David Cameron's been really nice to Huskies lately, and we've got the Liberal Democrats in there, and presumably this indicates there might be something to work with. And most of the big NGOs here in the UK, to which I will return later, most of the big NGOs said, well, okay, maybe it's not the government that we would have wanted, but it's a government we can work with, and we will work with them. So from day one, the story was accommodation. Find routes to those ministers inside the government that might be more amenable to reason and intelligence and open-mindedness and inclusivity and compassion and a different way of doing things. And somehow that view persisted despite all the evidence, even when the government revealed its true colours in its determination to sell off the public forest estate here in England. Most of our NGOs still went along with the idea this was a bunch of people with whom you could do business, including those sad Liberal Democrat ministers who were there just for show, as we now know. 5 years on, no need for any ambiguity. It is crystal clear what this government has in its mind. And we have seen that just in 2 months. The decisions that have been taken and the speed with which those decisions have been taken is honestly astonishing. Only one area that I'm going to reveal, but there are just so many places you could go here. But if you think about what it's already done on renewable energy and energy efficiency, the whole shape of the energy economy of the future, it's quite startling what has been done. Essentially, they're going to do everything they can to withdraw any government involvement in renewable energy here in the UK. Any. From 2018 onwards, and most of it will disappear through the rest of 2016. There will be no major UK-based schemes to retrofit existing housing in this country, which means that the scandalous horror story of fuel poverty will continue in this country for the next 5 years. I know it's hard to think about fuel poverty on a day like today, but just remind yourselves that there are already people who will be anticipating with dread another winter unable to heat their homes properly because they won't be able to afford the energy that they need. So nothing is going to happen on fuel poverty for the next 5 years. And it's a very clear story that's emerging. This government believes that the only way to achieve energy security with low bills is via fracking gas and building nuclear reactors. And those two things now override every other element in the energy portfolio. Every other element. So, we know where we are. And for me, that is amazingly helpful. Because as we do the work that we need to do, we need to understand what that context looks like. I keep coming back to this. We need to ask ourselves, how well equipped are we to make the interventions that we need to make? Now, I'm not downcast by this, obviously. After 40 years, one would not get downcast simply at the election of another bunch of ideologically driven wallies. I am really comfortable with this. It's happened many, many times in my life, and I dare say it'll happen a few more times too. So it isn't that would make me downcast. What makes me a little bit apprehensive about these 5 years is whether we can think about ways of summoning up the collective energy amongst all of those extraordinary organizations at the community level, regional, city level, national level, international organizations, to be more effective in the work that we need to do, to be more effective both in raising that clarion call about the absurdity of the approach adopted by this government, and more effective in advocating for and delivering on the ground the solutions which will demonstrate in practice what it is that we all stand for. It's that combination that is really important. And I suppose in that regard, I'm interested in where our environment movement is going to go in the next 5 years. I'm interested in what the big environmental NGOs will be doing right now in terms of thinking through their campaigning strategy and tactics for the next 5 years. I have to be absolutely honest that I am truly disappointed by the near invisibility of some of those organizations in some of the big debates that we're fighting here in the UK right now. It seems to me baffling that their voices are heard so rarely and often in a rather muted, quiet, unconcerned sort of way. So there's a big question mark for all of us, and most of us belong to multiple organizations, as you know. There's a seriously big question mark. What is the role of our big national NGOs now as we seek to make more sense of this next 5 years than would otherwise be the case? Okay, so enough of the tub-thumping stuff. It's just that sometimes you have to get it out there, because we all know that we can't really rely on conventional politics in the UK to do this for us. Anyone who thinks we're going to have much opposition from the Labour Party on any of this stuff, I hope, isn't planning to do too much in that respect over the next 5 years. This is a party that is as ideologically bought into the central premise of the Tory party as the Tory party itself. Anyone who thinks the Lib Dems are capable of doing much. Now, obviously, I'm a member of the Green Party. I'm chuffed as hell about the 1 million votes at the last election. I know there's been a lot of soul-searching going on since then, but for me there is enormous promise now in what the Green Party can do, can bring forward at such an important time. And I personally am going to be committed to that, in that part of my life as an activist, to helping the Green Party do what it needs to do over the course of the next 5 years. But today let's just dwell for a little bit on why we can kind of bear all that in mind, but nonetheless be pretty hopeful about some of the energy that we can draw down on as we plan for the next 5 years. And this is really where it's at for me now, at the community level, within the hearts and the minds of individuals working together through what is often referred to now as a collaborative commons, through finding ways of sharing their own internal resources, often through a community lens, through a community focus, to bring very practical solutions to bear on those things that matter enormously to people in the places where they live. Whether that is energy, and that will still be crucial, whether it's food, and we have to celebrate the enormous, burgeoning effect of food cooperatives and local food groups all over the country, whether it's things to do with resources, healthcare, whatever it might be. It's impossible, it is literally impossible to summarize the immensity of that energy at that level. As soon as you try and start to explain it, it kind of slips away again because it's both enormous and it's ubiquitous. It's just everywhere in our lives. But it is a bit incoherent, and we're not brilliant at sharing the learning that is going on at the community level. I think Transition Towns did a fantastic job trying to get that learning process going, but we need to build on that much more over the next few years. Why am I stressing that side of it? Because without the practicality, without the delivered solutions on the ground, there are going to be a lot of people still, in fact, indefinitely into the future, who will say this is all still airy-fairy stuff for the birds. This isn't going to change my life. That isn't going to improve my life. This isn't going to make things better for the causes I care passionately about, particularly in the social agenda. Causes to do with social justice, with addressing poverty, with addressing many of those deficits at the local level. We have to make this work practically, because it isn't until people see it working practically that people see how the bigger ideas that lie behind it, that very different, radically different worldview, would begin to assume a far more important part in everybody's lives. So I'm really intent on the practice, and I think one of the things about this festival that I loved right from the start when they were putting together very early ideas about this was stress the practicality. Don't live uniquely in the zone of theory in abstractions. Bring it right down to what we can do in our lives now. Find ways of bringing other people into that shared practical space, because it's in that space that many people will come to see what it is that we stand for, will see their own values reaffirmed through that practical action, and will, I hope, be encouraged to take more action themselves, to do more themselves. I'm convinced that that now is a critical part of the path forward for the next 5 years, matched, of course, by the need to tell a different story about the kind of society that we're looking for. And just briefly, I have to take time out to say, isn't it bizarre that when you look at sources of leadership for rethinking the kind of world that we'd all like to look in, how odd it is that we have to look to the Pope. Right now, I'm truly celebrating the fact that he has made a phenomenally important contribution to the climate debate, even as we await for an equally phenomenally important contribution on family planning, but that's clearly in the hands of God, as we know. So even as I celebrate that, I'm thinking to myself, this is so bizarre that people like the Pope and the Dalai Lama and the Prince of Wales, they're sort of out there doing all this leadership stuff, while the whole mass of politicians, seemingly the world over, are incapable of sharing any of that sense of a vision for a different world. You don't get any vision from the political classes around the world at the moment. It is completely astonishing to me. So, for me, the focus now is on that combination, is on brilliant practical action, shared experience and learning, the power of the community to make many of these ideas come alive in people's lives, political realism behind all of this, even as we seek to demonstrate through a different vision why it is that we could and should be living so differently on this planet. More than enough, I think you'd all agree, more than enough to keep us quite busy for the next 5 years.
I always get touched by your refreshing, no hands-on, candid approach. It's fantastic. Hands-on, candid approach. So, Q&A. Questions in the audience? Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I was very struck by your... I was following Paul Hawken and the Wiser Earth, attempt to bring all the sort of grassroots people together under one banner to network. And as you said, it's vast. It's absolutely vast. So I suppose my question is, how do we do that in an effective way? Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah. Well, don't waste... I think my only sort of throwaway advice would be don't waste a lot of time and resource trying to find a mechanistic and institutionalized way of doing it. Because I think that isn't what Paul Hawken is really talking about. What he's really talking about is that how do we find the connectivity between all of those different organizations, the ideas that lie behind them and the people that are making them work? How do we bring that connectivity into our lives to strengthen what we do and to make the totality of what we do just that much more substantive, bigger, transformative in other people's lives? And I'm therefore a tiny bit nervous about a sort of big new global thingy which would create, a consortium of every organization under the sun that subscribed to a more or less broadly progressive set of green, sustainable ideas. I don't know. I'll happily sign up to it, but I wouldn't do anything more about it having signed up to it, because I'd want to go on and get on with my work, as it were. So I think it's really important to surface it and share and understand what that looks like, but I don't think we should try and do a great big global institutional thingy, because I'm not sure that will really help.
Two things. First of all, can you say something about the biggest horror of them all, which is TTIP? And many people don't know about it. We had an absolutely packed meeting about it in Lewis a couple of weeks ago. And secondly, a plug for somebody who's speaking later today, Scilla Elworthy, her wonderful book, Enlightened Leadership.
Indeed, I can definitely give a plug for Scylla's work. I was very happy to endorse the book when it came out because it is a wonderful book. She's an amazing woman and a real leader. I mean, we're not short of real leaders. We just don't have them in many of our political parties. Green Party, obviously, exception. TTIP. So this is this transatlantic trade agreement that will be, unless we redouble our efforts in that respect, will still be signed between the EU and the United States, and will introduce into the diplomatic relationships, the trade and economic relationships between Europe and America, all sorts of really deeply disturbing new agreements and ordinances that they'll be able to use to promote their model of global free trade. We're in a much better place now than we were 2 years ago, when, as you know, this was a completely hidden agenda being pursued by negotiators on both sides of the Atlantic with hardly anybody, even in the mainstream parties, understanding what this was all about. Now it is out there. People are campaigning about it. The European Parliament is much more focused on it. As you say, local groups are much more active about this now. There is a big political process around it now that I think is very encouraging. It's very off-putting to be invited to try and work through implications of great big global trade agreements. You think, oh my God, am I really going to have to do this as well as go off to the food co-op and do this and all the rest of it? And we do have to do that kind of heavy lifting, because it is really a horror story, and it is a confirmation of the fact that many governments now are so deeply enthralled to the powers of multinational capital that they are incapable of exercising their proper responsibilities as defenders of that democratic space. And that's the real worry. That's the deep down worry.
Yeah.
Jonathan, my name's Adam Hunt. This is a personal question. I wonder how you balance the positivity that you have with the grief that you must feel. I say this because I'm really feeling the grief about what's going on, and have been recently. It seems to have accelerated over the last couple of years, the destruction of the planet and the craziness. I just wonder how you balance those two things.
Thank you. With difficulty is the answer, with enormous difficulty. And one of the privileges I have is seeing lots of things going on in different countries all over the place, and learning what the front line looks like in different countries. I'm spending a lot of time, for instance, now in Malaysia and Indonesia, and I've been struck all over again by the front line for the environment movement here in the UK. It looks very different from the front line for environmentalists in many of these countries, where the scale of the pattern of destruction is still astonishing, is still just completely startling. And it is really hard not to respond to that personally, and not to take in the pain of that, and to feel the grief of what is happening, knowing how much better we could be doing, just with a different approach to many of these things. For me, I don't turn away from that. I feel that pretty deeply and seek to address that, and to a certain extent bring it into the work that I do, just in terms of the psychological energy that I bring to bear on it. Now, I'm not sure this is necessarily a good thing, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it to anybody else, but I do convert a lot of grief into anger, and I'm told this is really seriously not good. But it sort of works. It kind of works when I'm feeling really, really despairing about something, and I'm just looking at another film of devastating stupidity in the natural world, or another impact on communities, whatever it might be. I can't turn away from that and just kind of sit there. So I tend to transmute that stuff into some of the anger that keeps bubbling up. And I know anger is a really complicated set of emotional responses, impulses to deal with. I think the one thing that I do feel comfortable about now is balancing the anger with the celebration. And my anger never gets in the way of having a good party. So that's the only balancing mechanism I can call upon. is doing the celebration stuff whenever anybody gives me an opportunity to do it, all over the place, whether it's private, intimate moments with a tree that I love, or whether it's shared, creative celebration of the human spirit in great big gatherings, whether it's quiet meditation, whatever it might be. So all of that stuff is the other half of it. But I'm driven a lot by anger still. And I'm not sure I'd be sitting on this stage now, 40 years on, if that anger wasn't, I feel it's building up, if that anger wasn't there. Because otherwise you'd think, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to do something very small and very little. I'm going to make a big difference in a little space, rather than making a very small difference in a massive space. But that's how I've kind of tried to make it work. I need notice that question next time.
I suppose, Julie, I remember when you were director of Friends of the Earth, and that was a seminal moment for me. So I have a question about what those NGOs are doing that I know you touched on, where they can go when they're being so quiet. I think, for what it's worth, I think the fallout from the unchanneled grief and anger is generally in our hairlines. I think that's where it kind of, you get direct fallout. But that's okay, we can age gracefully. So yeah, I think also part of my thing is, and I suspect it is with you as well, being frighteningly over-optimistic kind of keeps going with the channeled anger. So my question is about Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, because I remember those being huge in the 80s and 90s when I was getting involved in this stuff. So I just wonder where they've got to.
Yeah. Well, it's complicated, this, obviously, as I have a long and deeply affectionate and respectful involvement with all of these organizations during this time. And I know one thing that's happened that doesn't explain it, but it has happened, is that WWF, for instance, just decided 5 years ago, we can, for every pound we raise in the UK, we can get 10 times as much conservation value by spending it in other countries as we can in the UK. And they made a difficult strategic decision. It was really complicated. I wasn't involved as a trustee then, but I watched the decision, and people knew that it would impact on their ability to be influential here in the UK, but felt that was the right way to try and balance out responsibilities. So none of these things happen without a great deal of soul-searching in the organizations concerned. Greenpeace is primarily doing most of its work internationally, and doing fantastic work. Let's be absolutely clear. I am so full of admiration for the courage and the work of people in Greenpeace. It's staggering. It is staggering. I think it means they're a bit less visible in our lives here in the UK than I would like. For me, as still a passionate campaigner against nuclear power, I'm really upset that 4 superannuated former directors of Friends of the Earth seem to have more firepower in dealing with nuclear issues than the whole of Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace put together at the moment, because they're just not prioritising. We're about to get these 2 god-awful £24 billion worth of nuclear junk at Hinkley Point in a way that will devastate our ability to get renewable energy efficiency, smart grids, etc., etc. Devastated. And with great difficulty can we even get them to sign a bloody letter. I mean, there's something wrong there. Friends of the Earth. Well, I think it's been a difficult time for Friends of the Earth. I won't say any more than that. I'm hopeful that there will be a reactivation of the spirit of Friends of the Earth. And funnily enough, it may come back through the local groups, because Friends of the Earth has always had this wonderful tension between the national bit of it and the local groups. And the local groups were kind of left a bit on the margins over the last decade. And the bit that I would love to see Friends of the Earth come back with is just a huge, great surge of interest at the local level. More problematic to ask about what's happening with the RSPB, big organizations like that, who probably wouldn't sympathize with some of the more feisty campaigning lines of approach that we're taking here, but we still need them to be part of that. Yeah, it's a difficult one. But I think there's going to be change here. Let's be honest, I'm going to say this because I'm now very involved in universities at the moment in the UK, and there aren't young people who are passionate about this agenda don't necessarily see the way of expressing that passion by joining a national organization. It isn't an automatic connection like I think it used to be for a lot of young people in the 70s and 80s. If you were into this stuff, you joined one of those organizations because it helped you see more clearly what you could do as an individual. I think young people today are equally passionate about this, but they wouldn't automatically express that by signing up to one of those big organizations. And somehow we need to get a better fit between that extraordinary sense of energy in young people today and how we bring that through an often sclerotic kind of political system to impact on improving people's lives.
And my question is, how is it that we can link up more of these two movements? Because there is enormous passion and energy, enthusiasm and commitment in the whole kind of left anti-austerity movement, but the connections are not being made. I was the only person in that 750 people who asked a question. Now, the speaker didn't even mention it, about the climate and green issues. And I just add that everyone's eyes have been on Greece, and how do we make our alternative credible in the light of what Greece has had to do or felt it's had to do, even with a vote of the people, a referendum saying we don't want this. It's a real difficult issue, I know, but it is absolutely key as far as I can see.
Sure, it absolutely is. And I think it will serve the Green Party very well indeed, that it was absolutely outspoken in its election campaign as being determined to address issues about austerity and poverty and justice, as it was to address issues around climate, biodiversity, pollution, and so on. And it got a lot of stick for that in the press. I thought completely unjustified. From the day I joined the Green Party, it's always been a party totally committed to social justice as well as to biophysical sustainability. What would be the point of a Green Party that wasn't as committed to social justice as it was to protecting the environment? It would be a total waste of political space, honestly. And anyone who's not interested in social justice, don't bother about joining the Green Party because it's just stupid. So for me, the Green Party really, really went out on a line there throughout the election campaign, said these things are completely connected. The energy we need to bring to bear to address the fallout from 10 years of austerity-driven politics and another 10 years to come, and God knows, it looks like an indefinite punishment for the whole of humankind from now on. The arguments they brought to bear were very closely linked to climate change through one policy mechanism, for instance, which is called green quantitative easing. Sorry, I bet you didn't think you were going to get a little talk on green quantitative easing, but you know how our banks have been bailed out with tens of billions of pounds of quantitative easing, which essentially goes straight into the banks and doesn't really help build prosperity or jobs or anything. Well, green quantitative easing would go straight into the business of building green infrastructure across the country. In terms of the energy efficiency programs I was talking about, new infrastructure, renewable energy, different transportation systems, etc. And the Green Party has been taking this idea out and talking about it all the time. And it is those practical, very practical proposals that need to come forward. It won't surprise you to know that the 4 candidates for the leadership in the Labour Party, only one of those candidates even thinks like this and talks about these things at all, and more credit to him for doing it. But it's a hard struggle within the Labour Party. I do not know. I don't know how much more of its soul there is to be corrupted before there is a sort of realization that it's gone, that the reason why the party exists has gone completely, and they're not there yet. They're not at that moment of kind of existential realization that nothing that they do today connects with the history or the culture or the ethos, the values of what the party stands for. I mean, literally nothing. And you can see it working through the minds of many people who care about progressive Labour politics, but have just stared at the party for the last 15 years or more and said, not quite where we are, but maybe we can get it back a bit. I don't know. So you're right. These are the 2 big things of our time, and we have to work well to bring them together, and there are ways of doing it.
Plenty of energy, being cheap, so people use it more and more. People in the winter, I know people in the winter that wear summer clothes and they just heat their houses hotter and hotter because it's there and they can do it. And if they've got the money, then they do it. And I think unless this crash comes...
Okay. Well, that is a kind of what I call a fallback strategy for achieving a sustainable world, because we really want to avoid that if we possibly can, because you're you're kind of taking a massive, great risk then on the future of humankind. If we've come to the conclusion the only way that we're going to change our ways is when the level of pain in terms of non-availability of the things that make our life possible now is so intense that everybody says, okay, that was yesterday's reality, here's the new reality, now we're going to do it very differently. The biggest worry in all of those models is that will not be conducted democratically. At that point, some exceptionally unpleasant political systems will assert themselves, and the idea of having a sort of a sensible approach to sustainability against that backdrop with democracy seems to me to be very remote. So I know you're not saying that because you're advocating that, but boy, do we bloody well have to avoid that at all costs. And the way to do it, you said this, it's about education. This is not a kind of immovable, fixed thing about human nature, that we are born irresponsible and stupid and uncaring and throwaway and all the rest of it. We're not born like that. There's not something in the human genome that has made it ineluctably, unavoidably necessary for us to behave in this stupid, irresponsible way. It's about how we are allowed to grow as children and young adults. And I say this because I feel passionate about this. I'm so pleased I spent the first bit of my life as a teacher for 10 years in a comprehensive school, because all of this stuff that somehow there's a deterministic view of human nature that we'll never be able to do anything about was just so much bollocks. It was just completely and utterly irrelevant. When you looked at those kids and what they were capable of doing and how they responded to a nurturing environment and a way of bringing forward their own potentiality and their love of nature, their love of each other, all this kind of stuff, not in some hippy-dippy way that wasn't fitting in Shepherd's Bush. You can imagine none of this stuff was easy in Shepherd's Bush, but a group of 120 teachers who were all committed to an ethos of nurturing and enabling children to find ways to their own sense of responsible interactions with each other and their surrounding community. It wasn't magic, it was doable. It's part of the story about giving children the right opportunities to find what it is that makes us all human beings. And so the thrust of what you say is we have to go back to that understanding that much of this needs to start with how we enable young children from the earliest age to grow to be the young adults and then the adults which will allow this world to emerge without the kind of collapse that you're talking about. That is a really important part of what we all stand for, I think, in this movement.